Everyone. It's Professor Lung, and this week we are going to be talking about the plant tribe Eragrosteae. But before we get into Eragrosteae, we are going to continue our tribe from last week, Cynodonteae, with a couple more species, Buclodactyloides and Hilaria jamesii, which you can find on the associated pages on the slide, page 92 and page 100 of your North American Wildlands book. So the first grass we're going to go over this week is going to be buffalo grass, Buclodactyloides, also now known with an updated name as Butalua dactyloides, in the same genus as the other Cynodonteae plants we went over in the Cynodonteae lecture. It is a native perennial grass that occurs in many of the western United States. And in terms of its inflorescence, we consider this plant dioecious, which is a very important term you should know. This means that the plants are what we call unisexual or unisexual, which means the flowers on these plants only produce either female or male flower parts. And so one is pistillate and one is staminate. And so you can see an example of the staminate flowers or plant in the upper right photo. And so there you can easily see the anthers hanging out, which again, we've discussed before, and those are the pollen-bearing organs of grasses. And in this case, it only occurs in, again, a single individual, and then the other individual or another individual might have what we call pistillate flowers. So for the staminate flowers in the top right, it typically is a panicle of 1 to 4 spicate, primarily unilateral branches. I've underlined terms that we've already reviewed in previous lectures, but just so you're familiar with them and you can keep up with the terminology. Spicate, again, is a branch that kind of has a spike-like inflorescence. So this plant has a panicle that branches out with spicate or spike-like inflorescences off of those panicled, main panicled inflorescence. And then the branches are unilateral, and so as you can see as last time, the spikelets all are arranged on one side of the rachis. The spikelets themselves, typically there are 6 to 12 in 2 rows per branch, and so you can't really see all 12 or the kind of 2 rows right now because they're overlapping, and so we see one set of spikelets on this side, and there's likely another pair or row mirroring it on the other side that we can't particularly see in this photo. And 2 florets per spikelet typically, and then the second glume is typically what we call mucronate. And again, we've already gone over this term, but mucronate means it comes to an abrupt point, which isn't as easy to see in that staminate photo, but if you look here at these tips, at these pistillate flowers that we'll discuss next, these are also mucronate as well. So the pistillate flowers are plants, and again, so these separate by plants, kind of like how humans separate out by male and female sex. Dioecious plants or species means, again, they separate out by male or female or pollen-bearing and pollen-receiving plants or individuals within that population. And no single individual typically will have both pollen-bearing and pollen-receiving parts that might consist of what we call a perfect flower that we talked about in previous lectures. The pistillates are often what we call, occur in what we call burr-like clusters near the middle of the mid-culm or within the leaves. And the burrs fall off as a unit in terms of dispersal. If you're unfamiliar with the term burr, this is essentially burr clover, and so you can kind of see again, it kind of has these kind of sharp points that come out of the end of this kind of central kind of unit, which is what we're calling burr-like, and so these mucronate tops, so these are the burrs again, and these are pointed coming around this kind of center area, and here we can see that they are also burr-like with mucronate kind of tops. So the spikelets for the pistillate flowers typically consist of 3 per 5 per cluster and 1 flower per spikelet. And so a flower for a pistillate flower would be having this like the stamens and the ovary and the filaments. Typically, they also can become yellowish, and the second bloom also is mucronate as well, coming to an abrupt point, which you can't really see clearly in this photo. But we've discussed what mucronate is. In terms of its vegetative characteristics, it's often what we call a stoloniferous plant, which means it produces stolons. The stolons themselves are a little bit wiry, and so they're thin and wiry as they sound, and they often form mats and can be sod forming. The culms, typically for staminate plants, have culms that are erect from 5 to 25 centimeters, whereas pistillate plants typically have culms that are mostly unbranched and are not as tall and erect. The blades for these plants are flat. The leaf blades are flat to curling, and so they curl especially when they're dry. And oftentimes they have papilla-based hairs on both surfaces. And so with that figure that we just saw float up, you can see kind of what we see, these papillate stiff hairs that kind of stick out from both ends of the leaf. In terms of the growth characteristics for buffalo grass, or Bouteloua dactyloides, it is typically a warm season plant, and it starts its growth mid-spring with adequate moisture and then usually flowers by the summer. It often reproduces by both stolons and by seeds, so both through asexual and sexual reproduction. It also can withstand heavy grazing and dry conditions, which makes it a really great range species. But it can't tolerate shading, so that's a really important consideration, potentially with woody encroachment or shrubs or competition from non-native species. In terms of its forage, it's typically considered really great forage for all livestock classes and is also good for wildlife as well. And typically, a Bouteloua dactyloides will cure well and provide good winter grazing. In terms of its habitat, it typically occurs on dry plains with medium texture to fine texture soils, and it's rarely found on sandy soils. And it's really heavily used on rangelands because it can, again, withstand heavy grazing and dry conditions. So here's just another photo of Bouteloua dactyloides, and so you can kind of again see what a dioecious or unisexual plant is. And so on the left side, you can see the pollen-bearing portions, which again have anthers clearly sticking out in red here. Let me go ahead and just point them out. Here we are. Here we are. And then on this right side, we have the pollen-receiving portions of the flower, which then get pollinated, and the pollen goes down into the ovary, turns into a seed, and then the seeds are located right here. The caryopsis seeds are located within these little burr-like, I guess, conglomerates that get dropped down during dispersal. So the last plant we'll have from Cynodonteae is going to be Galeetta or Galleta grass, Hilaria jamesii, and you can see its beautiful flowers right above me. In terms of its stats, it's also a native perennial grass, and for its inflorescence, it actually has a spike type, which we haven't had again for a while, for a few weeks. So again, it has a spike type inflorescence, which often is very dense with its spikelets, and has about 10 to 25 nodes, and often is very hairy, as you can see in the photo here. Its rachis is actually wavy, and so you can't really see it that well in this photo, but if we were to take apart that densely spikelet spike, you would be able to see how like wavy essentially the rachis is. Rachis. In terms of its spikelets, there's typically 3 per node, and it's often very pilose, which is a very intense type of soft hairiness, as we can kind of see again in this photo right here. This is pilose at the base. Its central spikelet is often perfect, and blooms and lemmas are often mucronate, which we've already discussed again. And again, if a plant has perfect flowers that means it is a bisexual flower that has both the male and female pollen receiving, pollen bearing portions. And so this is not a dioecious plant that separates out within its population by individuals. Oftentimes the lateral spikelet is staminate, and the first bloom is awned. So that means the first lateral spikelets are often not perfect. And usually it gets a purplish hue and becomes a little bit more bleached colored at maturity. And so you can kind of see this kind of bleached color kind of around the blooms especially. In terms of its vegetative characteristics, it's a rhizomatous plant with long rhizomes, and often the rhizomes are slightly scaly, and so that just kind of gives some rough surface to the rhizomes itself. And typically they're considered rarely stoloniferous, so sometimes these rhizomes may not be as successful and they may produce stolons above ground, but this is just a rare instance. The culms of the plant are typically erect and wiry, and again that means it's kind of like stringy and not very stable, and they're often also glabrous or glabrous, a term we've already discussed, which means smooth or hairless. The nodes are villous and the base is branched and often decumbent. So decumbent, I think we haven't really discussed that before, but when we're thinking about decumbent, you might think of a plant that maybe starts at the base and it basically grows along the ground and then goes upwards. So that's decumbent. So again, that starts at a specific area and grows along the surface of the ground and then goes upwards. And so that's what decumbent means. And usually the blades are mostly basaled and they usually will curl when they're dried. Galeetta grass, typically it grows mainly in the summer after rains and is considered a warm season grass. It reproduces from both rhizomes and seeds. In terms of its forage quality, it's good for cattle and horses and wildlife, but it's only fair for sheep, and typically just when it's green. And usually it's pretty worthless when it becomes dormant and the plants start to senesce, die back a little bit, and there's not as much green vegetation. In terms of its habitat, it typically occurs in deserts, canyons, open valleys, and dry plains, and is really abundant in fine textured, so clay-like soils, but can also occur in coarser, sandier types of soils. And so here again is kind of the example. You can see how wavy that rachis is. So now we're going to get into our next tribe, which is going to be Eragrosteae. And so a note from Matt Levin, the Eragrosteae comprises of warm season grasses that produce spikelets that are very similar to those of Aveniae, when spikelets include only one floret, and certain Poae, when spikelets have multiple florets. Eragrosteae, however, usually, but not always, like we talked about with exceptions to every rule, they usually have hairy liticules and commonly have a very prominently three-veined lemma, which both Aveniae and Poae essentially never do. And so that's one way you can tell them apart, is their prominent three-veined lemma and their distinctly hairy liticule. Also, Eragrosteae are warm season grasses and as so are expected to put most of their biomass and flower later in the summer and only typically at lower elevations in more arid settings, whereas Aveniae and Poae often inhabit moist or montane settings. Species of Eragrosteae are all warm season grasses, mostly inhabiting disturbed areas. So our first Eragrosteae plant is going to be a favorite of mine, personally. It's called saltgrass, Disticula spicata. When people ask me sometimes what my favorite plant is, I will sometimes say saltgrass because it's salty, just like me. And the reason it's called saltgrass, just so we can be clear on it, is it often occurs in salty environments by the coast or in salt flats. And so one of the unique adaptations it has is it can actually accumulate the salt and basically precipitate it out onto their blades as salt crystals, which you can't see very clearly in this photo, but if you go out to one of the many locations that exist around us, you can basically pick a leaf and hold it up in the sun and look at it, and you'll see shiny salt crystals shining. It's considered a perennial native grass, and its inflorescence is often it's panicled and contracted, which means it kind of like gets oppressed and kind of goes up against that panicle, and it has really short pedicels. And so you can kind of see it kind of going up in this contracted kind of way. The spikelets, again, for this plant are unisexual, which again means they are dioecious, which means there are separate male and female or pollen-bearing and pollen-receiving plants. Typically, the spikelets have 5 to 15 flowers, and something that's characteristic of it is awnless. The staminate spikelets are often straw-colored, and then the pistillate spikelets are often green-colored. In terms of vegetative characteristics, it's often a rhizomatous plant with extensive rhizomes that can creep and become somewhat aggressive in a landscape, and often also has scaly rhizomes, which again kind of have this pattern along the rhizomes that give it a little bit of a roughness to it. The culms themselves are decumbent, and again, we just talked about decumbent. That means growing straight along the ground and then growing upwards after some distance. So the culms themselves can be decumbent or erect, so it can go straight up. And the internodes are typically short and numerous, and so it kind of gives it this look where there's a lot of leaf blades kind of coming up in a kind of a short internode distance. And the leaves themselves are glabrous, which again means hairless or no hairs. The blades themselves are conspicuously ranked and distichious or distichious, which essentially means that they come off on either sides of the plants, and they are sharply pointed and glabrous, and they spread stiffly. So they spread out, but they're very stiff. Oftentimes the pistillate plants and flowers don't get as tall as the staminate flowers. And if you think about that a little bit, you might be thinking, why? Well, staminate flowers have pollen, and pollen needs wind. And so the higher up, the better the wind can flow and kind of push it down onto pistillate plants. For its growth characteristics, we know it's also a warm season plant that typically starts its growth in early summer and remains green until the fall. It has relatively slow growth rate and reproduces primarily with rhizomes and not necessarily as much with seeds. It is really highly resistant to trampling. It can also be a really aggressive plant and become somewhat problematic in certain environments if competition is removed, and it can be important because it has very low forage value for most livestock and also for wildlife, and usually is not really used much for grazing purposes. It also can cause livestock losses through rumen compaction, which is only relevant to ruminant animals like cattle, especially if it's dried in kind of like the winter. And the sharply pointed blades are also not necessarily desirable as forage either. In terms of its habitats, it typically occurs in mostly alkaline or saline soils on inlands and seashores, and is frequently like dominant within its particular range or habitat or where it's growing. And so here you can see saltgrass growing more locally around our campus, around Cal Poly Humboldt and Arcata Bay. So if you're interested in seeing it in person, you can go check it out. And you can find these occurrence records on Cal Flora or on the E. Jepson Flora, or also on iNaturalist, but with less confidence. And then finally, for this week, we also have sand drop seed, also known as Sporobolus cryptandrus. So Sporobolus cryptandrus, or sand drop seed, is a native perennial species, and its inflorescence is panicle, and it's contracted to open depending on kind of where it occurs. So typically it's a bit more contracted lower down on the panicle, as you can kind of see here, and then it's more open as you get to the top of the panicle. It can also be totally or partially enclosed within that subtending sheath, which is kind of where a lot of this panicle might be contracted, kind of down here. The spikelets are often one-flowered and densely crowded, and a lead to gray purplish color. The spikelets themselves are often enclosed within a portion that is often cleistogamous, which means that it can self-pollinate. and really kind of basically produce seeds just on the flowering parts within that specific spikelet, which is actually kind of rare. Most plants, even though their flowers do include both the pollen bearing and pollen receiving portions, they're not cleistogamous, and they can't really produce a seed within a single floret. Whereas sand drop seed is cleistogamous, and with its perfect flowers, it can actually produce a seed within that spikelet and floret. The plant grows in a cespitous manner, and we've again gone over cespitous, but that means bunchy. And the culms are typically erect, growing anywhere from 0.3 to 1.2 meters tall, and it's often geniculate below, which again comes to an abrupt bend or turn, and it can be compressed and sulcate on one side, and again it's a glabrous or hairless along these kind of vegetative culms. The sheaths themselves, though, especially the throat and collar, often have very dense tufts of long hair, as you can see in this image here. And so that's a very defining characteristic of this plant. Sporobolus cryptandrus, or sand drop seed, typically grows at the beginning of early spring, and then the seeds usually mature June to August, and it's considered a warm season grass. It often makes abundant seeds, and so it can reproduce with those seeds and also through tillers. And oftentimes it can increase with heavy grazing and drought, which means that it's resistant to grazing and drought. In terms of forage value, it's usually pretty good for livestock, but not necessarily the best for wildlife. And like many other grasses, it rapidly declines in forage value as it reaches maturity. In terms of habitat, it typically occurs in open areas and in disturbed sites, most commonly on coarse textured soils like sandy soils, and can also occur in rocky silty soils, but is not tolerant of wet soils at all. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening.